Hey there folks, back again with another alternative history family tree, this time again being another one about inheritance in Great Britain. This time I'm doing one of what if Great Britain started with female preference primogeniture instead of the male preference primogeniture that it had in our own timeline. Now, could this have happened? Highly unlikely. I highly doubt it. Most of society back then was extremely patriarchal, and female preference primogeniture was more or less unheard of in the wider world, not just Europe. But even though it would practically never have a chance to happen at all, I still think that this is an interesting scenario just to look at what could have happened if it had happened. Now onto the chart itself. Great Britain started in 1707 with the first Queen, Anne, who had previously been the Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland since 1702. Now, the point of divergence in this comes with the very first successor to the Kingdom of Great Britain after Anne. Now, in our own timeline, the Kingdom of Great Britain, because of the laws of inheritance, skipped over many generations of Catholics, because Catholics and people married to Catholics could not inherit the throne of Great Britain. So it passed over to her distant cousin, George, who was the Elector of Saxony, and his descendants became the modern monarchs of Great Britain all the way to today with Charles III. However, in this timeline, we're going by female preference primogeniture. It would pass to his next eldest sister, who was not a Catholic or was not married to a Catholic, which was his sister, Sophia of Hanover. Unfortunately, she was dead. However, she happened to be married to the King of Prussia, Frederick I, and therefore their child, Frederick William, who had been King of Prussia since 1713, inherited Great Britain only a year after he inherited Prussia. This means that from 1714 all the way to 1740, both Great Britain and Prussia were ruled under the same monarch, Frederick William. Frederick William's reign was one of extreme growth in Prussia, so much so to where he was nicknamed by the people the Soldier King for the military growth that he put into Prussia. In this timeline, he would face both advantages and disadvantages from also holding the crown of Great Britain when it came to this. While yes, he would be able to grow Prussia much faster, of course having the economic and military backing of a far stronger kingdom, Great Britain, would benefit the other kingdom, that of Prussia, that it was in personal union with. However, Frederick William would face a very major problem in the first year of his reign, that being the Jacobites. Now, the Jacobites were basically the remnants of the House of Stuart that Queen Anne belonged to. They said that the anti-Catholic inheritance rules should not have been put in place, and that Queen Anne's relatives and the wider House of Stuart should have inherited the Kingdom of Great Britain instead. In this timeline, they would also not just be protesting against the anti-Catholic rules, but probably also the female preference primogeniture rules. As, of course, being Catholic, they probably would not be... Okay, well, being Catholics in the 18th century, they probably wouldn't be, very progressive, and probably would not be a fan of female preference primogeniture, either wanting it to be male preference primogeniture or absolute if they were a little bit more progressive, but the point still stands. Now, aside from the problems with the Jacobites, Frederick William would still likely be a very good king, introducing much military and economic reforms and growth in the Kingdom of Prussia, while ruling Great Britain as well. The only major problem between the kingdoms that I could really think of is the distance, in the fact that, unlike how the successor to Queen Anne in our timeline, George I, controlled Great Britain and Hanover, which were only separated by the North Sea, because Frederick William controlled both Great Britain and Prussia, there would be much more in their way. And by I mean much more, I mean the entirety of Mecklenburg, Hanover, Denmark, and many other smaller Holy Roman Empire states between them. Additionally with, of course, the North Sea. Now, Frederick William would die in 1740, which would, in this timeline, split the personal union of Prussia and Great Britain, as of course Prussia followed a male preference primogeniture instead of female preference primogeniture in this timeline, as they did in our timeline. And then Prussia would go down to the new king, Frederick the Great, while Great Britain would pass to his older sister, Wilhelmina. Now, almost immediately, the Kingdom of Great Britain would be plunged into war, that being the War of the Austrian Succession, of which Britain and Prussia would be on opposing sides. However, I'm inclined to believe that because of the situation of this timeline, there's two things that could play out. Either one is that both the kingdoms of Prussia and Great Britain go on the same side, meaning the outcome of the war could change, or what I'm more inclined to believe that would happen is neither kingdoms would get involved. The reason why I believe this is specifically because of the relation that Wilhelmina and Frederick the Great had. Now, Wilhelmina and Frederick the Great were extremely close friends as well as being siblings, so I imagine that both of them would likely be hesitant to join on a war that the opposing side was also on. However, just for the sake of consistency with our timeline, I'm just going to say that they did stay on the same sides they were in our timeline, but they would still remain friends. Now, near the end of her war, the Kingdom of Great Britain would end up joining the 7 Years' War, which the burden of that would fall onto her daughter, Elizabeth II. Now, Elizabeth II was also of the House of Hohenzollern that her mother belonged to, because her father, the Margrave of Brandenburg-Bayreuth, Frederick, was also of the House of Hohenzollern. It was her that the burden of dealing with the vast majority of the 7 Years' War would fall onto from her mother, as well as having to deal with almost the entirety of the American Revolution. Now, despite being the ruling monarch of Britain during the American Revolution, she would never actually get to see the end of it, as the end of the war is designated as being 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, in which Great Britain formally recognised the United States of America. She would never get to this date, as she died 3 years before it. Now, she and her husband, the Duke of Württemberg, never had any surviving children. Therefore, the inheritance would go to her aunt, who was the next senior woman in the family. Now, Frederica would only rule for 4 years and would likely be completely overseen in terms of monarchs. However, she is notable as being the monarch in which Great Britain would recognise the United States under, with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that I have mentioned before. And after her death, she would be succeeded by her son, who would be crowned Alexander IV, who was also of the House of Hohenzollern, much like how Elizabeth II was, because both of their parents, in both cases, were of the House of Hohenzollern. In her case, it was the Margrave of Brandenburg-Bayreuth. In his case, it was the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach. Now, it would be under Alexander IV that the Napoleonic Wars would start under. He would live through the entirety of the first 2 coalition wars, but would die a few months before the end of the 3rd one. The rest of the Napoleonic Wars would fall under the burden of his cousin Sophia, the first non-Hohenzollern to be on the tree, other than of course the first Queen Anne, as it would pass to Alexander IV's next senior female in the family, that being Princess Philippine Charlotte of Prussia, who married Charles I, the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, and therefore their daughter Sophia would be of the House of Brunswick-Bevern and would rule from 1806 to 1817. Now, interestingly enough, in our own timeline, Sophia nearly married none other than George III, the King of Great Britain, who in this timeline would of course only be the Elector of Hanover. However, she ended up marrying none other than her own aunt's ex-husband, Frederick the Margrave of Brandenburg-Bayreuth, though they never had any children together. As they never had any children together, the line would pass to the next eldest sister of hers, that being Anna Amalia of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Now, she married Ernst August II, the Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, and therefore their son, Charles III, would inherit. Now, Charles III was also the Grand Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach and would rule over both the Grand Duchy and Great Britain for a combined 11 years. The only major event that would happen during his reign would be the first few months of the Portuguese Civil War, although he would die before he could get to the end of it. Now, it's with the death of Charles III in this timeline that we see the first major split on the tree. This comes up to a decision of who we decide to be the person to inherit the throne with. It would go down his daughter's line, Caroline Louise, and it would either be inherited by her daughter, Helen, or her son, Albert. Now, the reason of the split would be because of the Act of Settlement Act of 1701, in which Catholics, and people who are married to Catholics, cannot inherit the Kingdom of Great Britain. And it just so happened that Helen was married to Ferdinand Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, who happened to be a Catholic. However, she happened to marry him after she would have become queen in this timeline. So I am inclined to believe that upon her marriage to Ferdinand Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, she would either request he convert to Protestantism so that she could remain being queen, or she would completely remove the Act of Settlement of 1701 and allow Catholics and people married to Catholics to rule over the British throne. Now, I can't come up with things, so I will have to follow the family tree that happened on both lines in this timeline. So I'm just going to assume for the first half of this that she did either convert to Protestantism or change the laws on Catholic inheritance to the kingdom. So, following her branch, she would rule from 1828 to 1858. Now, many major things would happen under her reign. One of the first being the Catholic Relief Act, which allowed Catholics to sit in Parliament, which would also play with the fact that later she would go on to marry a Catholic. It would also be in 1833 that slavery would be abolished in the Kingdom of Great Britain, and the entire empire with it. She would also have to deal with the Great Irish Famine, maybe being a bit kinder than our timelines Britain had been if the Irish and the British monarch shared Catholic connections with, of course, her being married to a Catholic, but I doubt it. Ireland was more or less seen as nothing short of a colony to the British, so we can assume that the same thing happened in our timeline that it is in this timeline. Now, she would be succeeded by her son, Philip. Now, Philip had actually previously served as the King of the French during the July Monarchy in its last 2 days of existence. He was of the House of Orleans, and for the rest of his life, him and his descendants would claim to be the rightful heirs to the Kingdom of France, being the Orleanist pretenders. This would mean that the ruling King of Great Britain from 1858 to 1894 would have one of the 3 majorly recognised legitimate claims to the Kingdom of France. Additionally, he may have also gotten the title the Emperor of India in 1876, as in our own timeline, Queen Victoria took it as a response to the rebellions happening in India, as it is of course a British colony. Now, he would be succeeded by his eldest daughter, Amelia. Now, Amelia would be extremely important in this timeline, as she would rule all the way from 1894 to 1951, dealing with the entirety of World War I and World War II for a total of 57 years. Now, she was married to the King of Portugal, Carlos I, and had 2 children who survived to adulthood, both sons, Louis Philippe and King Manuel II. Now, both her son Louis and her husband died on the 1st of February of 1908 during an event known as the Lisbon Regicide, when the royal family was targeted by various Republican sympathizers who did not want a monarchy and wanted a Republic of Portugal. Additionally, her son Manuel II, who would also reign as Portugal's last monarch, died before her without heirs. Because of her long reign, she outlived both the next female in the line, Helene, and the two children that Helene had, Amadeo, the Duke of Aosta, and Tomislav II, who also happened to reign as the King of Croatia from 1941 to 1943, when it was under Italian occupation during World War II. However, he abdicated when Mussolini, of course the dictator of Italy, was dismissed by the Italian king Victor Emmanuel III. So her successor would end up being her grandniece, who would be crowned as Margaret II, who would rule from 1951 all the way till 2022. Now, her husband was the Archduke of Austria-Este, a branch of the House of Habsburg. This means that the current ruling monarch of Great Britain since 2022, Mary III, will be of the House of Habsburg, at least in this timeline. Now, going back up the tree to where the split happens on the tree to Charles III, assuming that Helen wouldn't inherit because she was married to a Catholic, the Duke of Orleans, it would instead go to her brother Albert, who would rule for only 6 years before it would go back up to his uncle, the child of Charles III, Charles IV, who would also be the Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, much like his father. Now, all the things that happened under the rule of Helen on that branch of the tree would also happen under the rule of him, so I'm not going to cover it, but he would be succeeded by his daughter, who would be crowned as Mary III. Now, Mary III had married a member of the House of Hohenzollern, the Prince of Prussia, Charles III. Now, Charles III was her third cousin once removed, with their common ancestor being Frederick William, who was both the King of Prussia and Great Britain in this timeline. Charles would also be the brother of the last monarch of Prussia exclusively, Frederick William IV, as well as the first German Emperor, Wilhelm I. Now, first the crown would pass down to their daughter, Louise, who would rule from 1877 till 1901. Coincidentally, she would die the same year that Queen Victoria in our own timeline died, although her and her husband Alexis never had any children, so it would pass to the next woman in the family, who would be crowned Queen Anne II. Now, Queen Anne II would rule through almost the entirety of World War I. She would die only a few months before the end of World War I, in 1918. Now, with her, we run into a problem. In our timeline, she converted to Catholicism in the same year that she would have become queen, 1901. Now, I highly doubt that in this timeline she would convert to Catholicism with the knowledge that it would exclude her from the Kingdom of Great Britain. So, going off that pretense, I've decided to keep her here as queen, even though in our own timeline she would have converted to Catholicism. Now, she married Frederick William of Hesse-Kassel, and therefore all of her children were of the House of Hesse-Kassel, including her next heir, Elizabeth III, who would rule from 1918 to 1955, who would be the ruling monarch for the entirety of World War II. Now, from here the succession is rather easy, as it goes down to her daughter Antonia, that would reign from 1955 till 1963, and from her it would go down to her son Leopold, who would reign from 1963 till 2006. Now, this line would end here, as because nor Leopold nor Antonia had any more siblings or children that survived. So it would go back up to Elizabeth III to the next surviving relative. Her next surviving relative would be Sybil Marguerite of Hesse, who married Friedrich Baron von Vinck of the House of Vinck. Now, I wasn't able to find if their children are still alive today, or if their children even had any children themselves. So, although there might be members of the House of Vinck that are out there that would be the monarch in this timeline, I wasn't able to find information about that. So we're going to have to assume that they didn't have any children. So then from there, it goes to the next relative, who just so happened to be the King-elect of Finland, Vaino I. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Now, his child, Philip the Landgrave of Hesse, and him were dead in 2006, so it would go all the way down to this woman, who would be crowned Elizabeth IV and would be the current Queen of Great Britain since 2006. Now, she is married to Frederick Karl von Oberstdorf of the German noble family of Oberstdorf, and their children are private individuals, so I will not share any information about them, although Elizabeth IV would be the current reigning monarch in this scenario. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I presented both Mary III and Elizabeth IV as the candidates of if this timeline were to have happened. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any recommendations, I'd be happy to take them. But yeah. Bye.